Many associate the founding fathers of the United States of America with liberalism, and they also associate them with democracy. This categorization is understandable and in some sense well founded, but it is lacking in that there were, in many respects, those amongst the founding fathers who, given their ideological disposition, we would not consider liberal in the classical sense of the term, at least not fully liberal. This is manifest in none other than the Federalist and second President of the United States of America, John Adams. Hitherto the presidency of John Adams, Adams was a lawyer and one who was interested in political theory, which manifests latently in his work titled Thoughts on Government, written in 1776. Adams was an observer of government legal issues occurring between the British and the Americans. Namely, he wrote, and I quote, "Then and there the child independence was born," in reference to the speech delivered by James Otis, Jr. against the British writs of assistance, a law which allowed not only the police to enter the home of suspected colonists smuggling goods, but also citizens to help aid the British in clamping down on the colonists. Adams was also an outspoken critic of the Stamp Act, which was imposed on the American people by the British, which mandated a tax on stamped papers to help the war fund between England and France. Adams argued that the act violated British law, which allowed for those being taxed to consent to such a tax, and also to have a fair trial with a jury of one's peers. A true testament to the well-natured character of John Adams was his willingness to counsel the British soldiers involved in the Boston Tea Massacre, despite his bias in favor of the American people. John Adams held to his ideals, in which he believed that all men are entitled to a just and fair trial. The ideology of John Adams, like all of the founding fathers, was fundamentally a revolutionary one. He believed in independence from the British and praised the events of the Boston Tea Party. He no longer saw any compatibility between the ideals of the early Americans and the British. Thus, he conceded a revolution was the only and final solution, although he did have a different idea of the way in which it should be done as opposed to the other fathers, namely via negotiation. Under the guise of contemporary politics in America, both parties are often hesitant to say that the original ideology of the Founding Fathers was less liberal or libertine, so to speak. We must understand here that while the ideology of someone like John Adams was revolutionary, it would be mistaken to label it as libertine or liberal in the sense it is understood today. In order to understand any political ideology, we must understand one's conception of the state. Adams sees the ideal state as a republic, one in which a strong authority is held and order maintained. Here I shall quote at length Adams' thoughts on government. Quote, "That the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so, because the very definition of a republic is, quote, an empire of laws and not of men. That, as a republic is the best of governments, so that a particular arrangement of the powers of society, or in other words, that form of government which is the best contrived to secure an impartial and exact execution of the laws is the best of republics. Of republics there is an inexhaustible variety, because that the possible combinations of the powers of society are capable of innumerable variations. As good government is an empire of laws, how shall your laws be made? In a large society inhabiting an extensive country, it is impossible that the whole should assemble to make laws. The first necessary step, then, is to depute powers from the many to a few of the most wise and good. But by what rules shall you choose your representatives? Agree upon the number and qualifications of persons who shall have the benefit of choosing or annex as privilege to the inhabitants of a certain extent of ground. The principal difficulty lies, and the greatest care should be employed in constituting this representative assembly. It should be in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. Adams also goes on to speak about his conception of the division of powers into 6 points. Of government, legislative, executive, and judicial shall be left in this body. I think a people cannot be long free, nor ever happy, whose government is in one assembly. My reasons for this opinion are as follows. 1. A single assembly is liable to all the vices, follies, and fertilities of an individual, subject to fits of humor, starts of passion, flights of enthusiasm, partialities of prejudice, and consequently productive of hasty results and absurd judgments. And all these errors ought to be corrected and defects supplied by some controlling power. 2. A single assembly is apt to be avaricious, and in time will not scruple to exempt itself from the burthens which it will lay, without compunction, on its constituents. 3. A single assembly is apt to grow ambitious, and after a time will not hesitate to vote itself perpetual. This one fault of the Long Parliament, but more remarkably of Holland, whose assembly first voted themselves from annual to septennial than for life, and after a course of years, that all vacancies happening by death or otherwise should be filled by themselves without any application to constituents at all. 4. A representative assembly, although extremely well qualified and absolutely necessary as a branch of the legislature, is unfit to exercise the executive power for the want of two essential properties, secrecy and dispatch. 5. A representative assembly is still less qualified for the judicial power, because it is too numerous, too slow, and too little skilled in for the laws. 5. Primary sources: the American founding. 6. Because a single assembly possessed of all powers of government would make arbitrary laws for their own interests, execute all laws arbitrarily for their own interest, and adjudge all controversies in their own favor. What should be mentioned here also is Adams' conception of the way in which the militia should work. Quote, "The governor should have the command of the militia and all of your armies. The power of pardon should be with the governor and council. Judges, justices, and all other officers, civil and military, should be nominated and appointed by the governor, with the advice and the consent of council. Unless you chose to have the government more popular, if you do, all officers, civil and military, may be chosen by joint ballot of both houses, or in order to preserve the independence and importance of each house, by ballot of one house, concurred by the other. Sheriffs should be chosen by the freeholders of counties. So should the registers of deeds and clerks of counties. All officers should have commissions under the hand of the governor and the seal of the colony. The dignity and the stability of government in all its branches, the morals of the people, and every blessing of society depend so much upon an upright and skillful administration of justice, that the judicial power ought to be distinct from both the legislative and executive, and independent upon both, that so it may be a check upon both, as both should be checks upon that. The judges, therefore, should always be men of learning and experience in the laws, of exemplary morals, great patience, calmness, and coolness and attention." He also goes on to say, quote, "A militia law requiring all men, or with very few exceptions, besides cases of conscience, to be provided with arms and ammunition, to be trained at certain seasons, and requiring counties, towns, or other small districts to be provided with public stocks of ammunition and entrenching utensils, and with some settled plans for transporting provisions after the militia, when marched to defend their country against sudden invasions, and requiring certain districts to be provided with field pieces, companies, and matrosses, and perhaps some regiments of light horse, is always a wise institution, and in the present circumstances of our country indispensable. Laws for the liberal education of youth, especially in the lower class of people, are so extremely wise and useful that to a humane and generous mind no expense for this purpose would be thought extravagant. The very mention of sumptuary laws will excite a smile. Whether our countrymen have wisdom and virtue enough to submit to them, I know not, but the happiness of the people might be greatly promoted by them, and a revenue saved sufficient to carry on this war forever. Frugality is a great revenue, besides curing us of vanities, levities, and fopperies, which are all real antidotes to all great, manly, and warlike virtues." End quote. Finally, I must also add that being a part of the Federalist Party, Adams valued a strong national bank, military, and overall was an advocate of a strong central government, which was opposed to a lot of the southern people living in America. Here we truly see the genesis of the desire for a unified American republic and a true sense of American nationalism. Following on from the ideology of Adams, we can learn more about what he thought about governance through his foreign and domestic policy. The war between the French and the British was a hallmark issue for the Adams administration. The Federalist Party leaned more pro-British due to the fact that they viewed the Revolutionary War in France as anti-religious violent fanaticism. Although they defended the British, they were still pro-American independence and anti-monarchical, so in other regards they supported the French. The French saw America as England's ally, so they decided to antagonize American ships, and thus Adams advocated arming American ships and a navy, but at the same time trying to stay out of war with France. Instead of full-on war with France, Adams promoted the buttressing of the American navy and a strategy of antagonizing the ships, but not attacking per se. This was known as the Quasi-War. The affairs of the war between the British and the French not only influenced the foreign policy of the Adams administration, but also the domestic policy, namely the Alien and Sedition Acts. The acts fundamentally were put in place to guarantee the safety and stability of what was then America. The acts advocated an increase of naturalization to 14 years. It also advocated the ability of the government to deport anyone they considered to be a threat to American stability. And finally, the ability for the government to arrest anyone who spoke negatively about them in speech or in the press. The opposition to the Federalists and the ideology of John Adams can be seen in the formation of the Democratic Republicans Party created by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Democratic Republicans were almost entirely antithetical to the Federalists in that they supported the French. They also supported the absolute sovereignty of states and their rights. The notions of a strong military and national bank were also considered violations of the sovereignty of the states, so this too was also rejected. The fundamental disagreement between the two parties was on the amount of power the government has the right to possess. What is interesting here to note is that Adams was accused many times of monarchism, and this was most likely due to his Alien and Sedition Acts and his desire for a centralized state, along with the fact that he and his party supported the British, which was a monarchy. Some were even anticipating Adams to crown himself king. To conclude this video here, both the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists influenced the American conception of the state and power significantly in what one might call a great synthesis. That is to say, both ideologies, antithetical to one another, formed into one entity under the government we have today. We see this manifest in the ideals spread in contemporary American political discourse, such as the constant invocation of rights as well as the invocation of national security, which climaxed around the Cold War and the post-September 11th attacks. Many today would consider Adams a quote-unquote authoritarian, but what they don't seem to realize is that a authoritarian is what keeps people united and a country safe. Yes, it can be overdone, but so can freedom. What we see in John Adams is someone who supported a strong and unified nation, and none of the quote-unquote freedoms modern politicians value so much today can be maintained without a strong authority to ground them and maintain them. The original ideals of the Founding Fathers were not so libertine as some make it out to be, and while many consider this unfortunate, these same people do not understand the nature of power and the nature of organization of institutions on a mass scale.